My stepdaughter yanked my dead mother's necklace while I was wearing it, and my husband called me selfish when I tried to take it back. So I ruined her 18th birthday and revealed her as a thief in front of everyone. My stepdaughter Bailey had this habit of taking whatever she wanted from me, while her father watched and did nothing. She'd walk into our bedroom and grab my jewelry to wear to school. When I'd object, my husband Todd would say, "She's just borrowing it. Don't be so possessive." She never returned anything. My grandmother's earrings disappeared into her room. My wedding bracelet from my first marriage ended up broken in her backpack. Each time Todd would say, "Teenagers lose things. You're making her feel unwelcome in her own home by getting upset." The worst part was how she'd do it. Bailey would wait until I was wearing something, then walk up and take it right off my body. She'd unhook bracelets while I was cooking, pull rings off my fingers while I was typing, snatch earrings out while I was on phone calls. "I need this for my outfit," she'd say, already walking away. Todd called it sharing. "You're the adult. She's just a kid who wants to feel pretty." Bailey was 17 and had more jewelry than a store because she'd taken all of mine. The one thing I kept hidden was my mother's necklace. Mom died when I was 12, and this gold locket with her picture inside was all I had left. I only wore it on special occasions and kept it locked in a safe the rest of the time. Bailey had asked about it once and I'd explained it was off limits. "That's not fair," she'd whine to Todd. "Why does she get to have special things I can't touch?" Todd had tried to convince me to let her wear it just once, but I'd refused. "That necklace goes to my daughter Amy when she's older. It's not Bailey's to borrow." Bailey had stormed off calling me selfish and mean. On my mother's birthday, I wore the necklace to visit her grave. It was the 10th anniversary of her death, and I'd spent the morning crying at the cemetery. When I came home emotionally drained, Bailey was waiting in the living room. She walked straight up to me and grabbed the necklace. Not gently. She yanked it hard enough that the chain cut into my neck before snapping. "I have senior pictures tomorrow and I need something nice," she announced. I lunged for it, but Todd stepped between us. "Let her use it for the pictures. Your mom would want to be part of family memories." I was screaming about how that necklace was sacred, how Bailey had no right, how this was too far. Todd just held me back while Bailey walked to her room spinning my mother's locket like a toy. "You're being hysterical over jewelry," Todd said. "It's just a necklace. She'll give it back after the pictures." Bailey didn't give it back. She wore it every day, telling people her grandmother gave it to her. She'd open it and show Mom's picture, claiming it was Todd's mother who was very much alive. When I demanded it back, she'd cry to Todd about how I was trying to steal her grandmother's gift. Todd knew she was lying but said, "Just let her have it. Buy yourself a new necklace. I'll pay for it." He didn't understand that money couldn't replace my dead mother's locket. Bailey started taunting me with it. She'd swing it in my face during arguments. She'd leave it in places where I'd find it, then snatch it away when I reached for it. She'd tell Amy, my 10-year-old daughter, that Grandma loved her more, which is why she got the special necklace. Amy would cry, and I couldn't comfort her because it was supposed to be hers one day. I tried taking it while Bailey slept, but Todd had installed a lock on her door after I'd tried to retrieve my other jewelry. I tried asking her nicely, but she'd laugh and say possession is ownership. I tried involving Todd's parents, but they said I should be happy Bailey wanted to bond with my family heritage. Then came Bailey's 18th birthday party. Big celebration at a fancy restaurant with all her friends and Todd's entire family. Bailey wore my mother's necklace with a low-cut dress, making sure everyone could see it. She kept telling the story about her beloved grandmother who'd passed down this precious heirloom. That's when my Aunt Ruth walked in. I hadn't seen her in years, but Amy had secretly called her using my phone. Ruth was my mother's sister and had given Mom that necklace for her wedding. She recognized it immediately. Ruth walked straight to Bailey and said loudly, "Why are you wearing my sister's necklace? The one I gave her in 1985 with her wedding photo inside?" Bailey tried to stick to her lie. "This is from my grandmother. My dad's mom gave it to me." Ruth pulled out her phone and showed everyone the receipt she'd kept for sentimental reasons. The jewelry store record with the locket's serial number. The original photo of my mother wearing it at her wedding. "This necklace belongs to my niece and will go to Amy. You're a thief." I stood in the restaurant bathroom staring at my reflection while the party continued outside, my hands shaking as I processed what just happened. Ruth's voice still echoed in my head calling Bailey a thief in front of everyone, and I felt vindicated but also completely drained. Bailey's face when the truth came out was a mix of shock and rage that I would never forget. The fluorescent lights made my skin look pale and my eyes were red from the tears I'd been holding back for months. I gripped the edge of the sink and took 3 deep breaths, trying to steady myself before walking back out there. My neck still had a faint red mark from where Bailey had yanked the chain hard enough to break it. I touched the spot gently and felt a surge of anger mixed with relief that this nightmare was finally ending. The bathroom door opened and a woman I didn't know walked in, gave me a curious look, then quickly left. I couldn't hide in here forever, even though part of me wanted to. When I walked back to the table, Bailey had locked herself in the restaurant bathroom crying, while Todd tried to calm his relatives who were demanding explanations. Ruth sat calmly drinking her wine. The receipt and old photos still spread on the table as evidence. The restaurant manager hovered nearby, looking uncomfortable about the family drama unfolding in his establishment. Todd's face was bright red, and he kept running his hands through his hair the way he did when stressed. His cousin kept asking what was going on, and Todd just kept saying there was a misunderstanding. But Ruth's evidence sat right there on the table where everyone could see it. The jewelry store receipt with the serial number, the photo of my mother wearing the necklace at her wedding in 1985. The close-up shots Ruth had taken with her phone showing the inscription inside the locket. There was no misunderstanding and everyone at that table knew it. Bailey's friends were whispering to each other and some were already getting up to leave. The birthday cake sat untouched in the middle of the table with 18 candles that had burned down to nothing. Todd's parents cornered me near the entrance, demanding to know why I set up their granddaughter on her special day. Rita's face was red with anger as she insisted there must be some mistake, that Bailey would never steal. I was too tired to argue, so I just pointed at Ruth's evidence and walked away to find Amy, who was hiding under the dessert table. Rita followed me for a few steps, still talking, but I ignored her completely. I could hear Todd's father saying something about family loyalty, and how I should have handled this privately. The whole restaurant was staring at us now, and the manager kept checking his watch like he was counting down until we left. I bent down and looked under the white tablecloth where Amy was curled up with her knees to her chest. Her face was streaked with tears and she reached for me immediately. I crawled under there with her, not caring what anyone thought, and held her tight while she cried into my shoulder. She whispered that she was sorry for calling Ruth without asking me first. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for, that she did exactly the right thing. Amy wrapped her arms around me and whispered that she was scared about what happens next. I promised her that the necklace was coming back to our family where it belongs, but I could see the worry in her eyes about Bailey and Todd. We left the restaurant together while Todd stayed behind trying to manage his furious daughter and confused relatives. I held Amy's hand as we walked through the parking lot, and she kept looking back at the restaurant like she expected someone to chase us. The night air felt cold after being inside, and Amy shivered even though it wasn't that cold out. I put my jacket around her shoulders and we got into my car. Through the restaurant windows, I could see Todd still talking to his parents, and Ruth sitting alone at the table. Bailey was probably still locked in the bathroom. I started the engine and Amy asked if Dad was coming home tonight. I told her I didn't know, but that we would be okay either way. The drive home was quiet, except for Amy sniffling occasionally. I kept one hand on the wheel and held her hand with the other. At home that night, I sat in Amy's room while she fell asleep. The house strangely quiet without Bailey's usual noise. Todd didn't come home until after midnight, and when he did, he went straight to the guest room without speaking to me. I lay awake knowing this was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. Amy had fallen asleep holding my hand, and I carefully pulled away so I wouldn't wake her. I walked downstairs and checked all the locks on the doors and windows out of habit. The house felt different now, like something had shifted that couldn't be shifted back. I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table in the dark, watching car headlights occasionally sweep across the wall. When Todd's truck finally pulled into the driveway, I didn't get up. I heard him come in the front door and pause in the hallway like he was deciding whether to come find me. Then I heard his footsteps go upstairs and the guest room door close. I finished my tea and went upstairs to my own bedroom, passing the closed guest room door without stopping. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. The next morning, Todd appeared in the kitchen looking exhausted and immediately started defending Bailey before I'd even had coffee. He claimed she was just a confused kid who made a mistake and that I humiliated her in front of everyone. I reminded him that Bailey stole my dead mother's necklace and lied about it for months, but he kept circling back to how I should have handled it privately. I poured coffee with shaking hands and told him I tried handling it privately while he did nothing. Todd leaned against the counter and rubbed his face like he hadn't slept at all. He said Bailey called him 6 times last night crying, so hard she could barely breathe. I asked if she mentioned giving back the necklace and Todd looked away. He started talking about how Bailey was embarrassed in front of all her friends and how this would follow her forever. I slammed my coffee mug down hard enough that some spilled and told him that stealing from me would follow her forever because actions have consequences. Todd flinched and said I was being cruel. I laughed without any humor and asked how I was the cruel one when his daughter stole my dead mother's necklace. I told Todd that I tried handling it privately for months while he did nothing, and that Ruth showing up was Amy's doing because our daughter was tired of watching her inheritance get stolen. Todd looked shocked that Amy was involved and tried to blame me for putting ideas in her head. The argument got louder until I was yelling about years of enabling and he was yelling about me being cruel to his daughter. I told him Amy called Ruth herself because she was tired of watching Bailey wear the necklace that was supposed to be hers someday. Todd's face went pale and he asked what I meant. I explained that Amy had been watching Bailey taunt me with that necklace for months and finally took matters into her own hands. Todd tried to say that Amy was too young to understand what she was doing, but I cut him off. Amy understood perfectly that Bailey was a thief and that her father wouldn't do anything about it. Todd started pacing back and forth in the kitchen, running his hands through his hair over and over. He said this was all getting out of hand and we needed to calm down and think rationally. I asked him what part of his daughter stealing from me required calm, rational thought. Todd stopped pacing and admitted that Bailey still had the necklace and refused to give it back, claiming it was hers now since she'd worn it for months. My vision went red with rage as I informed him that's not how theft works. He suggested we let her keep it a few more days until she calmed down, and I realized he still didn't understand the problem at all. I told him I wanted the necklace back today, right now, this minute. Todd said Bailey wasn't even here. She'd stayed at his parents' house last night. I asked if he was serious right now, if he really thought I would wait even one more day to get my mother's necklace back. Todd tried to explain that Bailey was too upset to deal with this today and needed time to process. I grabbed my phone and told him I was calling Ruth back because clearly he still didn't get it. Todd asked what Ruth had to do with anything, and I told him she had everything to do with it since she was the only person who seemed to understand that theft is theft. I called Ruth and asked her to come back over because I needed backup dealing with Todd's continued denial. She arrived within an hour with copies of all the documentation and sat Todd down for a conversation that felt more like a legal deposition. Ruth laid out the papers on the dining room table in neat rows and started explaining property law to Todd like he was a child. She showed him the receipt again with the serial number that matched the necklace. She showed him the photos of my mother wearing it at her wedding. She showed him the inscription inside that said my mother's name and wedding date. Todd kept trying to interrupt, but Ruth held up her hand and kept talking. She explained family heirlooms and the difference between borrowing and stealing while Todd squirmed uncomfortably in his chair. Ruth told him that Bailey had no legal claim to the necklace, and that keeping it was theft regardless of how long she'd worn it. Todd tried to say that Bailey thought it was a gift, but Ruth pulled out her phone and played a recording. Amy had recorded Bailey taunting me about the necklace weeks ago, saying she knew it wasn't hers, but she was keeping it anyway. Todd's face went white as he listened to his daughter's voice bragging about stealing from me. Bailey emerged from her room around noon, eyes red from crying, and immediately started yelling at me for ruining her life. She claimed all her friends were laughing at her, and that I was a terrible stepmother, who never wanted her to have nice things. I stayed calm and simply held out my hand for the necklace, but she clutched it to her chest and ran back to her room. I heard her door slam, and then the sound of something heavy being pushed against it. Todd started to go after her, but Ruth blocked his path and told him to let me handle this. I walked upstairs slowly and stood outside Bailey's door. I could hear her crying inside, and part of me felt bad, but mostly I just felt tired. I knocked and told her I wasn't leaving until I got the necklace back. Bailey screamed that it was hers and I had no right to it. I reminded her through the door that Ruth had proof it belonged to my mother, and now belonged to me. Bailey yelled that possession was 9/10 of the law and she'd had it for months. I told her that didn't apply to stolen property, and she knew it. I stayed outside Bailey's door listening to the muffled voices inside. Todd's voice was low and soothing, the same tone he used when Bailey was little and had nightmares. I could hear Bailey crying and saying things I couldn't make out. An hour passed while I stood in the hallway getting more angry with each minute. When Todd finally came out, he closed the door carefully behind him like he was leaving a sick person who needed rest. He looked at me with tired eyes and said Bailey was too upset to deal with this right now. She needed time to process what happened at the party. I stared at him in disbelief and asked if he was serious right now. He tried to explain that forcing her to give back the necklace immediately would only make things worse. I told him I was calling a locksmith to remove her door lock since she was using it to hold stolen property. Todd's face changed from tired to shocked, like I'd suggested burning down the house. He asked if I'd lost my mind, and I told him no. I'd finally found it. I called 3 locksmiths before finding one who could come that afternoon. Todd followed me around the house trying to convince me to wait, to give Bailey space, to handle this differently. I ignored him and made lunch for Amy, who was hiding in her room. When the locksmith's van pulled into the driveway, Todd actually stood in front of Bailey's door with his arms crossed. The locksmith looked between us confused and asked if there was a problem. I told him no problem, just removing a lock from my house. Todd said we needed to discuss this first, and I told him we could discuss it, or I could call the police to report the theft officially. His arms dropped to his sides. Bailey started screaming from inside her room that we were violating her privacy. Her voice was high and panicked. She yelled that her dad wouldn't let this happen, that he loved her, that I was trying to destroy their family. Todd stood there looking miserable, but he finally stepped aside. The locksmith got to work with his tools while Bailey kept shouting. She threatened to call her mother, to call her grandmother, to tell everyone what kind of person I was. Todd stayed in the hallway watching the locksmith work with this lost expression on his face. I wondered when he'd become so weak that he couldn't protect his own wife from theft. The lock came off after about 10 minutes of work. I paid the locksmith and he left quickly, probably glad to escape the family drama. I pushed open Bailey's door and found her sitting on her bed holding the necklace against her chest. Her mascara had run down her face in black streaks, and her eyes were red and swollen. She looked younger than 18 sitting there like that. I walked over slowly and held out my hand. I told her this was her last chance to give it back before I involved the police. My voice came out calm even though my heart was pounding. Bailey looked past me to where Todd stood in the doorway. She was waiting for him to rescue her like he always did. I glanced back and saw Todd just standing there silent for once in his life. Bailey's face crumpled when she realized he wasn't going to save her this time. She threw the necklace at me hard enough that it hit my chest and bounced off before falling to the floor. Then she screamed that she hated me and wished I'd never married her dad. She said I'd ruined everything and she hoped I was happy now. I bent down and picked up my mother's necklace with hands that were shaking. I opened the locket to check the photo inside. Mom's face smiled up at me from her wedding day. The picture slightly faded but undamaged. I closed it carefully and walked out without saying anything to Bailey's tantrum. I went to my bedroom and locked my door behind me. I sat on the bed and held the necklace in both hands. That's when I finally cried for the first time since the party. The chain was damaged from when Bailey yanked it off my neck weeks ago. There were small scratches on the locket from months of her wearing it without care. I cried for my mother who died when I was 12. I cried for Amy who'd watched her inheritance get stolen. I cried because my own husband couldn't protect something this important to me. The tears came hard and I didn't try to stop them, I just sat there holding the necklace and letting myself feel everything I'd been pushing down. Amy knocked on my door about an hour later. I unlocked it and she came in without saying anything. She climbed into my lap even though she was getting too big for it. We sat together while I held the necklace and she held me. I showed her the photo of her grandmother inside the locket. I told her stories about Mom that I hadn't shared in years. Stories about how Mom loved to garden and always had dirt under her fingernails. How she made the best chocolate chip cookies and always burned the first batch. How she sang off-key in the car and didn't care who heard. Amy listened carefully to every word. She asked if she could keep the necklace in her room now that we had it back. I explained that I needed to get it repaired first because of the damage. Then we'd find a safer place for it together where nobody could take it again. That evening, Todd tried to talk to me about moving forward. He used that phrase like we'd had a small disagreement instead of his daughter stealing my dead mother's necklace. He suggested family therapy, but the way he said it made it clear he thought I needed help with my anger toward Bailey. I told him the only therapy happening was him learning why his daughter turned out this way. He got defensive immediately and said I was blaming him for everything. I asked him who else I should blame since he'd enabled Bailey's behavior for years. He said teenagers make mistakes, and I said stealing isn't a mistake. It's a choice. We went back and forth until I was too tired to argue anymore. I told him to sleep in the guest room and he left without fighting about it. Bailey stayed in her room for 2 days straight. She only came out when Todd brought her food on a tray like she was sick. I heard them talking through her door when I walked past. I caught pieces of conversations where Todd said things like, "She's always been jealous of you and some people are just materialistic about things." I realized he was rewriting the whole story in his head, making me the villain who was mean to his poor daughter, making Bailey the victim of my cruelty instead of the thief she actually was. I wondered how I'd married someone who could twist reality this much to avoid admitting his daughter had serious problems. On the third day after getting the necklace back, Todd's sister called me. She asked why I attacked Bailey at her birthday party in front of everyone. I was confused at first until I realized Bailey had been calling family members with her version of events. In Bailey's story, I'd falsely accused her of stealing, and Ruth was somehow in on some kind of conspiracy against her. Todd's sister wanted to know what was wrong with me and why I'd embarrass a teenager like that. I was so tired of defending myself that I just hung up the phone. I didn't have the energy to explain the truth to someone who'd already decided I was the bad guy. The calls kept coming all week. Todd's relatives, parents of Bailey's friends, even some of my own distant cousins who'd heard things through social media. Bailey had posted vague things about abusive stepmothers and being accused of things she didn't do. She made herself look like the victim of some terrible injustice. People who didn't know the full story believed her because she was young and crying and good at playing innocent. I watched my reputation get destroyed in real time while Todd did nothing to correct the lies his daughter was spreading. He said it would blow over and people would forget about it. I told him some things don't blow over and some people don't forget, but he didn't seem to understand what I meant. The next week was worse than I expected. Amy came home from the school on Thursday with tears already streaming down her face before she even opened the front door. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard her backpack hit the floor in the hallway. She ran straight to me and buried her face in my shirt. Her whole body shook while she cried and I just held her, my hands getting wet from her tears. When she finally calmed down enough to talk, she told me that kids in her grade were saying things. Bailey's friends had younger siblings at Amy's school and they were spreading stories. They said I was mean and crazy. They said I attacked Bailey at her birthday party for no reason. They said I made up lies about Bailey stealing things. Amy had tried to defend me during lunch, but 3 girls cornered her by the lockers after and told her that her mom was a liar. My 10-year-old daughter had to stand there and listen to teenagers call me names while teachers walked past without noticing. I asked Amy what she said back, and she told me she tried to explain about the necklace, but they just laughed at her. One girl said Bailey showed them proof that the necklace was really hers. I didn't know what proof Bailey could possibly have, but it didn't matter because kids believed her. Amy asked me why people thought she was lying when she was telling the truth. I didn't have a good answer for that. Todd came home an hour later and I told him what happened at Amy's school. He sighed like I was bothering him with something small. He said kids say mean things sometimes and it would blow over. I stared at him standing there in his work clothes, acting like this was normal. I told him that his daughter's lies were hurting my daughter at the school, and he needed to do something about it. Todd said he would talk to Bailey, but I could tell from his voice that he wouldn't actually do anything. He asked what I wanted him to do, and I said make Bailey tell the truth. Todd said Bailey was going through a hard time after being embarrassed at her party. I reminded him that she was embarrassed because she got caught stealing my dead mother's necklace. He didn't have an answer for that, so he just walked away to change his clothes. That night, I lay in bed thinking about how alone I felt in this marriage. Todd was supposed to be my partner, but every time I needed him to stand up for Amy and me, he protected Bailey instead. I realized that I was completely on my own when it came to keeping my daughter safe from his daughter's cruelty. The next morning, I called Georgia while Amy was at the school. Georgia was my best friend from college, and we'd stayed close even though she lived 2 hours away now. I asked if Amy and I could come visit for the weekend, and she immediately said yes without asking why. I packed bags for both of us that afternoon, and when Amy got home from the school, I told her we were going on a trip. Her face lit up for the first time all week. We left Friday evening and drove to Georgia's house while Todd was still at work. I texted him that we needed space and would be back Sunday night. He called 3 times, but I didn't answer. Georgia lived in a small house with a guest room that had 2 twin beds. Amy fell asleep early that night, exhausted from the week. Georgia and I stayed up late drinking wine on her back porch while I told her everything. I explained about Bailey's years of stealing my jewelry, about the necklace, about the birthday party, about Todd never standing up for me, about the lies Bailey was spreading now. Georgia listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I'd been afraid to admit to myself. She told me that Todd had never really been on my team. She said I'd been making excuses for him for years, but the truth was that he chose Bailey over me every single time. She asked me why I was staying in a marriage where my husband didn't protect me or my daughter. I started crying because hearing someone else say it out loud made it real. I told Georgia I didn't know what to do, and she said I needed to decide if this marriage was worth fighting for or if it was time to walk away. That weekend at Georgia's house felt like a refuge. Amy played in the backyard and smiled more than she had in weeks. Georgia took us to the park and out for ice cream. We watched movies and stayed up late talking. For 2 days, I didn't have to deal with Bailey's manipulation or Todd's enabling. I could think clearly for the first time in months. On Sunday afternoon, my phone rang and it was Todd. I almost didn't answer, but Amy was watching me, so I picked up. Todd sounded embarrassed when he spoke. He said Bailey had a few friends over Saturday night and things got a little loud. The neighbors complained about the noise around midnight. I asked him what he meant by a few friends, and he admitted it was more like 20 people. I felt my stomach drop. I asked if he punished Bailey, and there was a long silence. Then Todd said he talked to her about being respectful of the neighbors. I knew that meant he did absolutely nothing. He said there was some minor damage to the living room, but he'd already cleaned most of it up. I told him we'd be home that evening and hung up before I said something I'd regret in front of Amy. Georgia looked at me and shook her head. She told me I deserved better than this, and I knew she was right, but leaving felt impossible. Amy and I drove home Sunday night, and I dreaded walking through that front door. When we got there around 8, the house looked normal from outside. Inside was a different story. The living room had a dark stain on the carpet near the couch that looked like spilled alcohol. Someone had broken the glass on a picture frame that held a photo of Amy and me. The frame sat on the side table with cracks spreading across our faces. I walked to the kitchen and found the recycling bin full of beer bottles. I counted 15 bottles, and Bailey was only 18. Todd appeared in the doorway looking guilty. He said he was sorry about the mess and that he'd tried to clean everything. I pointed at the beer bottles and asked him if he realized his daughter threw an underage drinking party in our house. Todd said all kids experiment with alcohol and I needed to pick my battles. I told him this wasn't about picking battles. This was about Bailey breaking the law and destroying our home. He said the damage wasn't that bad and he'd pay to replace the frame. I asked him again if he punished Bailey and he avoided my eyes. He said Bailey promised it wouldn't happen again and that should be enough. I realized right then that nothing would ever be enough to make Todd actually parent his daughter. Monday morning, I started calling jewelry repair shops. The first 2 places I called said they couldn't help me because the necklace was too old. The third place said they could do it, but I needed to bring it in for an estimate. I drove there during my lunch break and showed the jeweler my mother's locket. He examined it carefully with a small magnifying glass. He showed me where the chain was completely broken and would need to be replaced entirely. Then he pointed out damage to the locket's hinge from rough handling. The hinge was bent and wouldn't close properly anymore. He said fixing everything would cost $300 and take about 2 weeks. I stood there looking at my mother's damaged necklace and felt rage building in my chest. Bailey had treated this precious family heirloom like a cheap toy from a mall store. She'd yanked it hard enough to break the chain and handled it so carelessly that she bent the hinge. $300 to fix the damage she caused, and 2 weeks without having it safe in my possession. I paid the deposit and left the necklace with the jeweler feeling sick to my stomach. That evening, I found Todd in the living room watching television. I sat down next to him and told him we needed to have a serious conversation about consequences for Bailey. He immediately tensed up, and I could see him getting defensive before I even finished talking. I listed everything Bailey had done, starting with stealing the necklace, then lying about it for months, then spreading lies about me after getting caught, and now throwing an underage drinking party. Todd interrupted me to say that Bailey was going through something difficult after being publicly humiliated. I felt my patience snap. I told him Bailey was publicly exposed for actual theft, not falsely accused of something she didn't do. There was a huge difference between being humiliated for no reason and facing consequences for your actions. Todd didn't seem to understand the difference at all. He kept talking about how embarrassed Bailey felt and how hard this was for her. I pointed out that it was also hard for Amy, who was bullied at the school because of Bailey's lies. Todd said that would pass once people forgot about the party incident. I told him people don't just forget when someone gets caught stealing. He suggested that maybe I was making things worse by not letting it go. I stared at him, wondering how he could possibly think I was the problem here. Todd then said something that made me realize he wanted to avoid dealing with this entirely. He suggested that maybe Bailey should move in with her mother for a while until things calmed down. I asked him what he meant by things calming down, and he said until everyone stopped being so upset. I told him I was fine with Bailey moving out, but she needed to apologize to Amy and me first. She also needed to publicly correct the lies she'd been spreading about me. Todd immediately said I was asking too much. He claimed Bailey wasn't ready to apologize yet, and I needed to be patient. I asked him how long I was supposed to wait for an apology, and he didn't have an answer. I told him that if Bailey moved to her mother's house without apologizing, then she wasn't coming back until she did. Todd looked uncomfortable but didn't argue. The next morning, after Todd left for work and Amy went to the school, I went into Bailey's room. The lock was still off the door from when I'd had it removed to get the necklace back. I decided to do a full inventory of my jewelry since I finally had access to her space without barriers. I started searching through her dresser drawers and jewelry box. In the top drawer under some scarves, I found my grandmother's pearl earrings. These were the earrings that had disappeared 2 years ago. Bailey claimed she'd never seen them, but here they were mixed in with her cheap costume jewelry. I kept searching and found my wedding bracelet from my first marriage in her jewelry box. This was the bracelet Bailey said she'd lost after borrowing it. The clasp was broken just like she'd told me, but she'd lied about losing it. She'd kept it this whole time. I laid everything out on her bed and kept searching. Over the next hour, I found at least 15 other pieces of my jewelry hidden throughout her room. Rings in her nightstand drawer, necklaces hanging in her closet behind her clothes, bracelets in a shoebox under her bed. I took photos of everything with my phone, making sure to get clear pictures of each piece. I was documenting years of theft that Todd had dismissed as teenage forgetfulness. I heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up to see Todd standing in the doorway. He'd come home early from work for some reason. He looked at me kneeling on the floor surrounded by jewelry and asked what I was doing. His tone suggested I was the one doing something wrong by being in Bailey's room. I didn't answer him. Instead, I gathered all the jewelry and carried it to our bedroom. Todd followed me asking what was going on. I dumped everything on our bed and stood back so he could see the pile. I watched his face go pale as he realized how much jewelry was there. This wasn't just about one necklace anymore. This was years of systematic theft that he'd enabled by refusing to believe me. Todd tried to claim that Bailey probably forgot these items were mine. Maybe she thought they were gifts I'd given her. I pulled out my phone and showed him photos of me wearing most of these pieces. Photos from before they disappeared. Photos I'd kept because I loved these items and wanted to remember wearing them. The evidence was undeniable. Even Todd couldn't spin this into innocent mistakes or teenage forgetfulness. He stood there staring at the pile of stolen jewelry and didn't say anything for a long time. I heard the front door open and knew Bailey was home from the school. Her footsteps came up the stairs and down the hallway. She walked into her room and I heard her gasp. I walked back to her doorway with Todd behind me. Bailey stood in the middle of her room staring at her bed where I'd laid out all the jewelry before moving it. She spun around and saw me standing there. Her face went red and she started screaming about her privacy and her rights. She yelled that I had no business going through her things. I let her finish her tantrum and then I spoke calmly. I told her she had 2 choices. She could return everything now and apologize to Amy and me, or I would file a police report for theft. Todd stood in the doorway behind me looking torn. I could see him wanting to protect his daughter, but also finally understanding that she was actually a thief. Bailey looked at her father waiting for him to rescue her like he always did. This time Todd just stood there silent. Bailey's face went red and she started screaming about how I had no right to go through her stuff. She grabbed a handful of rings and bracelets from the bed and threw them at me. The jewelry hit my chest and clattered to the floor while she yelled that I could have my cheap stuff back. She never wanted any of it anyway, according to her, which was a total lie given how she'd been stealing from me for years. I stayed calm and kept taking photos with my phone. I photographed each piece as I picked it up off the floor, making sure to get clear shots of any scratches or damage. Bailey's tantrum got worse instead of better. She stomped her feet on the carpet like a little kid having a meltdown in a store. Todd tried putting his hand on her shoulder to calm her down, but she shrugged him off and kept yelling. He looked helpless standing there watching his daughter act like a toddler. I collected the last piece of jewelry from the floor and walked past both of them without saying anything. I heard Bailey screaming behind me about how unfair this was and how everyone always took my side. That weekend, I was in the kitchen making lunch when someone started pounding on the front door. I opened it to find Todd's mother, Rita, standing there with her arms crossed and an angry look on her face. She pushed past me into the house before I could even say hello. Rita immediately started attacking me for traumatizing Bailey with my accusations. She claimed I'd always been jealous of Bailey's close relationship with Todd. The necklace situation was just me being mean and vindictive toward a girl who'd never done anything wrong. I let her finish her rant, and then pulled out my phone. I showed Rita the photos of all the stolen jewelry I'd found in Bailey's room. There were at least 20 pictures showing different pieces spread across Bailey's bed. Rita's face went through several expressions as she scrolled through the photos. First, she looked like she didn't believe what she was seeing. Then she got angry and tried to claim the photos were fake somehow. Finally, she just went quiet and stared at the screen. She couldn't explain away that much evidence no matter how hard she tried. Rita handed my phone back and changed her approach completely. She started talking about how blended families need to share everything. I was being selfish about material things when what really mattered was family harmony. She said everyone should have access to everyone else's belongings because that's what real families do. I asked Rita if she'd feel the same way if someone stole her wedding ring. Would she be okay with that person wearing it every day and lying about where it came from? Rita opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't have an answer to that question. After a long silence, she said I was still handling everything wrong. I should have kept this within the family instead of making it public at Bailey's birthday party. Rita left a few minutes later looking upset and confused. After Rita drove away, Todd came out of the bedroom where he'd been hiding during her visit. He admitted his mother had called him crying about how I ambushed her with evidence. Todd was upset that I'd shown his mom proof of Bailey's stealing. Now Rita was questioning how they raised Bailey and wondering what they did wrong as parents. I pointed out that maybe they should question their parenting since they raised a daughter who steals and lies without any guilt. Todd stared at me like I'd just slapped him across the face. He walked away without responding, and I heard him go into his office and close the door. 2 days later, Amy's school counselor called and asked me to come in for a meeting. I drove to the school that afternoon wondering what was wrong. The counselor explained that Amy had been anxious and distracted in class for the past few weeks. Her grades were dropping, and she seemed worried all the time. I felt terrible as I explained the situation at home with Bailey stealing things and the family conflict. The counselor listened carefully and suggested that Amy might benefit from therapy to process everything happening in our family. I agreed right away and asked for recommendations. The counselor gave me names of 3 child therapists in our area. I sat in my car after the meeting feeling guilty that my 10-year-old needed professional help. This was all because her stepsister was a thief, and her stepfather refused to do anything about it. I called the first therapist on the list that evening and scheduled an intake appointment for Amy. While I was on hold waiting to confirm the appointment time, I decided to check my credit card statements online. I logged into my account and started scrolling through recent charges. My stomach dropped when I saw purchases I definitely didn't make. There was online shopping from stores I'd never heard of, food delivery orders on days when I'd cook dinner at home, subscription services I'd never signed up for. I looked at the dates and realized the charges started around the same time Bailey took my mother's necklace. I added up the total and it came to over $2,000. Bailey hadn't just been stealing my jewelry, she'd been stealing my money too. I printed out 3 months of credit card statements and highlighted every charge I didn't recognize. Then I marched into Todd's office and dropped the papers on his desk. He looked up from his computer and asked what this was about. I told him to look at the highlighted charges and tell me if he made any of those purchases. Todd picked up the statements and his eyes got wider as he read through them. For once, he looked genuinely shocked and couldn't immediately defend Bailey. I informed him I was calling the credit card company to report fraud and filing a police report. Todd jumped up and begged me to wait. He asked me to let him talk to Bailey first before I involved the police. Todd went to Bailey's room and closed the door behind him. I stood in the hallway and could hear them talking but couldn't make out most of the words. Then Bailey's voice got louder and I heard her crying. She yelled something about needing things and not thinking I would notice the charges. The conversation went on for almost an hour. When Todd finally came out, he looked exhausted. He offered to pay back the $2,000 himself if I didn't call the police. I told him that completely missed the point. Bailey needed to face real consequences for stealing instead of having Daddy bail her out again like he always did. The credit card company called me back the next morning. A fraud investigator named Lillian Reese explained that my situation was complicated. Since Bailey was a family member who lived in the house and had access to my wallet, proving fraud would be difficult. Lillian suggested I file a police report anyway to create a paper trail even if I decided not to press charges. I thanked her and drove to the police station that afternoon. I filled out a report listing all the unauthorized charges and providing dates. The officer taking my report asked if I wanted to press charges against Bailey. I said I wasn't sure yet, but wanted everything documented. When I got home, Todd was sitting on the couch looking miserable. He said I was making everything worse by escalating instead of handling it privately as a family. That night after Amy went to bed, I told Todd I was done. I was done with Bailey stealing from me. Done with him enabling her behavior. Done with being treated like the bad guy for wanting basic respect in my own home. I told Todd he needed to make a choice. He could support his wife and daughter Amy, or he could keep protecting Bailey from facing any consequences. Todd said I was being unfair by making him choose between his daughters. I told him that refusing to choose was itself a choice. He was choosing Bailey over Amy and me every single time he made excuses for her stealing. I grabbed my pillow and a blanket from the bedroom closet and walked down the hallway to the guest room. Todd followed me asking what I was doing, and I told him I needed space to think about whether this marriage could work. He grabbed my arm and started panicking, promising he'd do better, hold Bailey accountable, make everything right. I pulled away and reminded him I'd heard these exact promises 100 times before. He needed to show me actual change, not just throw words at me when things got bad. I closed the guest room door and locked it, then sat on the bed staring at the wall. Amy knocked softly 20 minutes later and asked if she could come in. I opened the door and she stood there in her pajamas looking scared. She asked if we were getting divorced and I told her honestly that I didn't know yet. She started crying and I pulled her into a hug, promising that no matter what happened between Todd and me, she would always be safe and loved. We sat together on the guest bed until she fell asleep and I carried her back to her own room. The next morning, Bailey was waiting in the kitchen when I came down for coffee. She asked if we could talk and I nodded, pouring myself a cup while she fidgeted with her phone. She said she heard I was thinking about divorce and that she wanted to fix things between us. I watched her face and could tell this wasn't about genuine remorse. She was worried about her dad's marriage ending, not about the harm she'd caused. Bailey launched into an apology that included the words "but," and I didn't mean to, at least 5 times. She said she was sorry for taking the necklace, but I should have been more willing to share. And sorry for the credit card charges, but she really needed those things. And sorry for lying, but she felt like I never gave her a chance. I set my coffee down and told her I don't accept apologies that come with justifications and excuses. A real apology takes full responsibility without trying to shift blame back onto the victim. Bailey's face turned red and she yelled that I was impossible to please, that nothing she did would ever be good enough for me. She stormed out of the kitchen and slammed her bedroom door hard enough to rattle the walls. Todd appeared in the doorway looking exhausted. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. I drank my coffee and waited for him to speak. Finally, he looked up and said, Bailey needed to move to her mother's house for a while. I almost dropped my mug because I never expected him to actually follow through on consequences. Todd went upstairs and I heard him knock on Bailey's door, then their voices rising as they argued. Bailey screamed that he was choosing me over her, that he was abandoning his own daughter. I stood at the bottom of the stairs listening to Todd actually stand firm for once. He told her that her behavior had consequences, and living with her mom temporarily was one of them. Bailey cried and begged, but Todd didn't cave. He came back downstairs looking sad but determined, and I felt cautiously hopeful that maybe he was finally getting it. Bailey spent the next few days making everyone miserable with her crying and dramatic declarations about being unwanted. She called her friends and told them her evil stepmother was kicking her out. She posted vague things on social media about family betrayal. Todd stayed firm despite the guilt trips, and I watched him struggle with it, but not back down. That Saturday morning, Kathleen pulled up in her car, and Bailey dragged her suitcases down the stairs with maximum drama. She announced to anyone listening that we were abandoning her, and she'd never forgive us. Kathleen came to the door and gave me a cold look like this whole situation was somehow my fault, even though her daughter had been stealing from me for years. Bailey hugged Todd and cried into his shoulder, then got in her mom's car without looking at me. They drove away, and the house immediately felt lighter. Amy came out of her room where she'd been hiding and actually smiled for the first time in days. Todd looked sad watching them leave, but also relieved, which told me he knew deep down how bad things had gotten. With Bailey gone, Todd and I started having real conversations instead of just fighting. We sat in the living room that first evening after Amy went to bed, and Todd admitted things I'd been waiting years to hear. He said he'd always felt guilty about his divorce from Kathleen and overcompensated by never saying no to Bailey. He thought if he gave her everything she wanted, she wouldn't feel the pain of her parents splitting up. I told him that his guilt had turned his daughter into someone who believed she was entitled to everything, including other people's most precious belongings. Todd nodded and didn't argue or make excuses this time. He said he could see now how his enabling had hurt Bailey's development and damaged our marriage. We talked until midnight about boundaries and parenting and what it would take to rebuild trust between us. Tuesday afternoon, I drove to the jewelry store to pick up my mother's necklace. The jeweler brought it out in a small velvet box, and when I opened it, the locket looked beautiful with its new chain and repaired hinge. The gold gleamed under the store lights, and I could see where they'd carefully fixed the damage Bailey had caused. I paid the $300 and drove home holding the box carefully on the passenger seat. Amy was doing homework at the kitchen table when I got back, and I called her over to show her the necklace. Her eyes went wide when she saw it looking perfect again. We decided together to keep it in the new safe I'd bought, the one only I had the combination to. Amy asked if she could look at it sometimes, and I told her whenever she wanted, because it was going to be hers one day, just like her grandmother intended. We put the necklace in the safe together, and Amy hugged me tight. That weekend, Todd suggested we try marriage counseling. I agreed, but told him it was only happening if he also did individual therapy to work on his enabling patterns. He started to resist, saying he didn't need a therapist to tell him how to parent his own daughter. I made it clear that counseling was completely required if he wanted any chance of saving our marriage. Todd thought about it for a long time, then finally agreed. We found a counselor who had availability and scheduled our first appointment for the next week. I also made Todd promise to find an individual therapist within 2 weeks, and he said he would. I wanted to believe him, but decided to wait and see if he actually followed through this time. Todd started his individual therapy sessions 3 weeks later. At first, he came home from appointments looking defensive and annoyed, complaining that the therapist didn't understand his situation. But gradually, something shifted. He started recognizing how his guilt about the divorce had made him afraid to parent Bailey effectively. His therapist helped him see that protecting Bailey from consequences had actually hurt her development instead of helping her. Todd came home from sessions looking emotionally exhausted, but also more aware of the damage his enabling had caused. He talked about things he was learning in therapy, about patterns he'd never noticed before. It was the first real sign that he might actually change instead of just promising to change. Bailey called Todd constantly from her mother's house. I could hear her voice through his phone complaining about rules and chores and how unfair everything was. She tried every guilt trip she knew to convince him to let her come back. Todd surprised me by telling her that she couldn't come back until she was ready to follow house rules and respect everyone's belongings. Bailey hung up on him, and Todd stood there looking at his phone with this sad expression. But he didn't immediately call her back or cave to her demands like he used to. He put his phone down and went back to whatever he'd been doing. I watched him handle it and felt hopeful that the therapy was actually working. Amy's therapist called me in for an update meeting after Amy had been going for 6 weeks. The therapist reported that Amy was doing much better now that the home environment was calmer. Amy had told her therapist that she'd been scared all the time before because she never knew when Bailey would take something or start a fight. My 10-year-old daughter had been living in fear in her own home, and I hadn't fully understood how bad it was. I felt guilty that I'd let things get that far before taking action. That evening, I sat down with Amy, and we had a long talk about boundaries and safety. I promised her that our home would be a safe place from now on, that nobody would be allowed to steal from her or make her afraid. Amy asked if Bailey was ever coming back, and I told her honestly that Bailey might come back eventually, but only if she learned to respect other people and follow rules. Amy nodded and said she hoped Bailey could learn, but she was glad things were peaceful now. 2 months passed with Bailey at Kathleen's house, and the peace at home felt almost strange after all the chaos. Amy relaxed more each day, sleeping better and smiling easier. Todd kept going to his therapy sessions and seemed genuinely committed to working on himself. We were settling into a routine that actually felt healthy when my phone rang one Tuesday evening. Kathleen's name flashed on the screen and I handed it to Todd, figuring she wanted to talk about Bailey. He answered and walked into the kitchen while I helped Amy with her homework. I could hear his voice getting tense, then frustrated, then resigned. When he came back 15 minutes later, he looked tired. Kathleen wanted to send Bailey back because she couldn't handle her anymore. Bailey refused to follow any rules, stayed out past curfew, skipped her community service hours, and fought with Kathleen constantly about everything. Kathleen said Bailey needed structure she couldn't provide, and that maybe we'd have better luck. Todd looked at me waiting for my reaction, and I took a deep breath before responding. I told him Bailey could only come back if we had a family meeting with clear written rules and real consequences. No more verbal promises that disappeared when things got hard. Todd agreed immediately, which surprised me, and we started looking for a family therapist who specialized in blended families. We found Winston Crawford, who had good reviews and experience with situations like ours. His office could fit us in 2 weeks out, so we scheduled the appointment and Todd called Kathleen back to tell her the plan. Bailey wasn't happy about having to wait or attend a mediated session, but Kathleen told her those were the terms. The day of the family meeting arrived and we drove to Winston's office in separate cars since Kathleen was bringing Bailey directly from her house. The office was in a small building near the mall, decorated in calming blues and grays that probably cost a fortune. Winston met us in the waiting room, a man in his 50s with gray hair and kind eyes that still looked sharp and observant. He shook hands with everyone and led us to a large conference room with a round table instead of the usual therapy couch setup. Bailey slouched in her chair with her arms crossed, already defensive before anyone said anything. Kathleen sat next to her looking exhausted, and Todd sat between me and them like he was trying to physically bridge the gap. Winston started by explaining how the session would work, and setting ground rules about respectful communication. Bailey rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath. Winston heard it and immediately addressed her directly, asking her to speak up if she had something to say. Bailey looked startled that he called her out so quickly. She tried to play innocent, but Winston didn't let her deflect. He asked her point blank why she was here and what she thought needed to happen. Bailey launched into her victim story about how I hated her and made her life miserable and took away all her things. Winston listened without interrupting, then asked her specific questions about the necklace, the other jewelry, and the credit card charges. Bailey tried to cry and blame me for being mean, but Winston redirected her every time. He asked her to take accountability for her specific actions without bringing up anyone else's behavior. Bailey got frustrated and looked at Todd for rescue, but he stayed quiet. Winston spent 40 minutes just on getting Bailey to acknowledge what she actually did instead of why she felt justified doing it. It was exhausting to watch, but also satisfying to see someone finally not let her manipulate the narrative. By the end of the 2-hour session, Bailey managed something closer to a real apology. She admitted she took the necklace knowing it was wrong. She admitted she kept other jewelry that wasn't hers. She admitted she used my credit card without permission. Her voice shook and she cried, but this time it felt more genuine than her usual performance tears. She said she was sorry for hurting me and Amy, and sorry for lying to everyone about where the necklace came from. Winston asked her why she did those things, and Bailey struggled to answer at first. Eventually, she said she wanted to feel special and important, and taking my things made her feel like she mattered. It was twisted logic, but at least it was honest. Winston helped her understand that stealing doesn't actually fill emotional needs. It just creates more problems and pushes people away. Todd looked like he might cry listening to his daughter finally admit the truth. I felt a tiny bit of hope that maybe Bailey could actually change if she kept working with Winston. After the apology portion, Winston shifted to talking about what would need to happen if Bailey moved back home. He pulled out a notepad and started writing down requirements as we discussed them. Respecting other people's belongings and asking permission before touching anything. No locked doors anywhere in the house so we could do random room checks. Mandatory attendance at family therapy sessions every week. Repaying the credit card charges through actual work, not just Todd handing her money. Following house rules about curfew, chores, and schoolwork. Real consequences that would actually be enforced when rules got broken. Bailey complained that it sounded like prison and too strict for someone her age. Kathleen surprised me by backing us up completely. She told Bailey that she needed structure and accountability, and that these rules were reasonable for someone who'd proven she couldn't be trusted. Todd stayed firm too, nodding along and adding his own requirements about honesty and communication. I watched him actually parent his daughter for once and felt cautiously impressed. We spent another 30 minutes hammering out specific details and consequences. Winston typed everything up on his laptop right there in the session so we'd have a written contract before we left. Bailey signed it along with the rest of us, though she looked miserable doing it. Winston scheduled weekly family therapy sessions starting the following week, and told Bailey he expected her to do individual sessions with him too. She agreed without arguing, which showed she understood this was serious. 3 weeks later, Bailey moved back into our house with 2 suitcases and a much quieter attitude than when she'd left. The first few days felt awkward with everyone tiptoeing around each other and being overly polite. Bailey kept to herself mostly, going to her room after dinner and only coming out when necessary. She was sullen and resentful, but she followed the rules because Todd actually enforced consequences when she tested boundaries. The first time she missed curfew by 20 minutes, Todd took her car keys for 3 days like we'd agreed in the contract. Bailey cried and argued, but he didn't cave. I stayed out of most interactions with Bailey, focusing on protecting Amy and letting Todd rebuild his relationship with his daughter on healthier terms. Amy watched everything carefully, clearly waiting to see if the changes would last or if things would go back to how they were before. I promised her privately that I wouldn't let that happen, that the rules applied to everyone now. Our weekly family therapy sessions with Winston became the anchor that held everything together. The first few sessions were tense with lots of silence and uncomfortable moments, but Winston kept pushing us to communicate better. He taught us how to express feelings without attacking each other and how to listen without getting defensive. Bailey slowly started opening up about stuff she'd never said before. In one session about a month after she moved back, she admitted she felt jealous of Amy and my relationship. She said watching Amy get attention and affection from me made her feel left out and unimportant. She took my things because she wanted to feel special too, like she mattered as much as Amy did. It didn't excuse the theft, and I told her that directly, but it was the first time she'd been honest about her real motivations instead of just making excuses. Winston helped her understand that stealing things doesn't create real connection or make people love you. He worked with her on healthier ways to ask for attention and build relationships. Todd cried during that session, finally understanding how his guilt about the divorce had made him overcompensate in ways that hurt Bailey's development. I felt some sympathy for Bailey hearing her talk about feeling invisible, even though I was still angry about everything she'd done. 4 months after the birthday party explosion, Bailey knocked on my bedroom door one Saturday morning holding a cardboard box. She asked if she could come in and I said yes, curious what she wanted. She set the box on my bed and opened it to reveal jewelry I thought was gone forever. Pieces she'd hidden at Kathleen's house that hadn't been in her room when I did my inventory. My mother's pearl earrings that disappeared 3 years ago. A silver bracelet my first husband gave me for our anniversary. A ring that belonged to my grandmother. Bailey's hands shook as she showed me each item and explained where she'd hidden them. She apologized again, and this time her voice sounded more real, though I could tell saying sorry was still hard for her. She didn't make excuses or blame anyone else, just said she was sorry for taking things that weren't hers and for lying about it. I thanked her for returning everything and told her honestly that rebuilding trust would take a long time. She nodded and said she understood, then asked if there was anything she could do to help fix things between us. I told her that following through on her commitments and respecting boundaries was the best place to start. She nodded again and left without arguing or getting defensive, which felt like real progress. Todd kept going to his individual therapy sessions every week, and our marriage counseling every other week. I could see actual changes in how he handled Bailey now. He said no when she asked for things she hadn't earned. He followed through on consequences even when she cried or got angry. He stopped automatically taking her side against me in disagreements. Our relationship started improving slowly, as I began trusting him again to actually be my partner, instead of just Bailey's defender. We went on date nights and talked about things other than family drama. He apologized multiple times for how badly he'd handled everything before, and I could tell he genuinely meant it this time. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it felt genuinely better than it had in years. The counselor helped us work through resentments and rebuild intimacy that had been destroyed by all the conflict. I stopped sleeping in the guest room, and we started acting like an actual couple again, instead of just roommates managing a crisis. One evening, Amy came to me and asked if she could invite Bailey to her school play next month. I was surprised because Amy had been keeping her distance from Bailey since she moved back. I asked Amy if she was sure, and she said yes, that she wanted to try having a relationship with her stepsister if Bailey was really changing. I told Amy it was completely her choice and that I'd support whatever she decided. Amy called Bailey into the living room and invited her directly, which took courage I was proud of. Bailey's face lit up and she said she'd love to come, that she'd been wanting to do something nice for Amy but didn't know how to ask. The night of the play arrived and Bailey showed up early with flowers for Amy. She sat with us in the audience and actually seemed engaged in the performance instead of being on her phone. When Amy came on stage, Bailey cheered loudly and took photos like a proud older sister. After the play ended, Bailey found Amy backstage and told her she did great. Amy beamed with pride and hugged Bailey, and I saw something shift between them. It was a small moment, but it showed that maybe they could have a real relationship someday if everyone kept doing the work. 6 months after everything exploded at Bailey's birthday party, I decided it was time to officially give Amy my mother's necklace. I'd gotten it repaired months ago, and it had been sitting in the safe waiting for the right moment. I called Ruth and invited her to come for the ceremony since she was the one who'd exposed the truth and started this whole journey toward healing. Ruth drove up that Saturday, and we gathered in the living room with Amy, Todd, and Bailey. I brought out the necklace in its original jewelry box and sat down with Amy on the couch. I told her stories about her grandmother that I hadn't shared in years, about how strong and kind she was, about how much she would have loved Amy. I explained that this necklace was supposed to go to her all along, that it represented our family history and the love that connected us across generations. Amy's eyes filled with tears as I placed the necklace around her neck and fastened the clasp. She touched the locket gently and asked if she could open it. I showed her how to work the tiny hinge, and she stared at the photo of her grandmother inside. Amy wrapped her arms around me and cried happy tears, while Ruth took photos to document the moment. Todd watched from his chair looking emotional, and I felt grateful that we'd made it through everything to get to this point. Bailey stood in the doorway watching the whole ceremony, and I could see complicated emotions crossing her face. Regret for what she'd done, sadness that she wasn't part of this family legacy, maybe still some jealousy that Amy was getting something special. But she didn't interrupt or try to make the moment about her, which showed real growth from the girl who would have thrown a tantrum 6 months ago. After we finished and Amy was showing Ruth how the locket opened, Bailey walked over quietly. She looked at Amy wearing the necklace and told her softly that it looked beautiful on her. Amy smiled and thanked her, and Bailey smiled back before walking away. The moment passed without drama or conflict, just a simple exchange that felt almost normal. I watched Bailey go back to her room and felt something close to hope that we might actually become a real family someday. Not perfect, but functional and maybe even happy. Todd suggested date night a week after the necklace ceremony, and I almost said no out of habit. We hadn't been alone together in months without talking about Bailey or therapy or consequences. But our counselor had been pushing us to reconnect as a couple instead of just co-parents managing a crisis. So I agreed. We went to a small Italian place across town where nobody knew us and wouldn't ask about family drama. Todd ordered wine and we sat there awkwardly at first, both of us out of practice at being just a married couple. He reached across the table and took my hand, telling me he was proud of how I'd handled everything with Bailey and Amy. I felt something warm in my chest that I hadn't felt toward him in a long time. We talked about the future for the first time without it feeling scary or impossible. Todd apologized again for not protecting Amy and me earlier, for letting his guilt about the divorce turn him into someone who couldn't say no to Bailey. I told him what mattered was that he was doing the work now, showing up to therapy, enforcing boundaries, being the father Bailey actually needed instead of the pushover she wanted. Our marriage wasn't what it was before all this happened, but it was becoming something different and maybe stronger. We were building something new on honesty instead of avoidance, on real communication instead of Todd just agreeing with whatever made Bailey happy. By the end of dinner, we were laughing about something stupid and holding hands like we used to, and I felt hopeful that we might actually make it through this. Bailey started community college that fall and got a part-time job at a coffee shop to pay back the credit card charges. She complained constantly about how early her shifts started and how her feet hurt from standing all day. Todd listened but didn't rescue her from the consequences like he would have before. I watched him tell Bailey that she made the choice to steal, and now she was making it right, and I felt proud of him for following through. Bailey was careful about respecting boundaries now in ways she never was before. She'd knock before entering our bedroom. She'd ask before borrowing my car or taking food from the fridge. The change was slow, and sometimes she'd slip back into old entitled patterns, but then she'd catch herself and apologize. I noticed she kept her room cleaner and did her chores without being reminded most of the time. The coffee shop job seemed to teach her things about working hard and earning money that Todd's enabling had prevented her from learning. She came home tired and sometimes grumpy, but she was paying back what she stole $20 at a time from each paycheck. It wasn't perfect, and some days I still didn't trust her completely, but it was real progress that she was earning through actual work. Amy wore the necklace to the school for Grandparents' Day and came home practically bouncing with excitement. She told me all about sharing stories with her class about her grandmother, about how she'd opened the locket to show everyone the photo inside. Amy said she talked about how her grandma died when I was young, and how the necklace was passed down through our family. Some of Bailey's friends' younger siblings were in Amy's class, and they saw the necklace, told Amy it was pretty. Amy said Bailey's friends mentioned it to Bailey later, and Bailey didn't claim it was hers, or get upset, or say anything mean. She just agreed that it looked nice on Amy. I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me hearing that. Amy could finally enjoy her inheritance without fear of it being stolen or having Bailey taunt her about it. The necklace meant something beautiful again, instead of being this symbol of theft and family conflict. Amy kept touching it gently while she talked, treating it with the care and respect it deserved, and I knew my mother would have loved seeing her granddaughter wear it so proudly. Life settled into a new normal over the following months. Bailey lived with us under clear rules that Todd actually enforced. She had a curfew, she had to keep her grades up, she had to maintain her job and make her payments. Todd actively parented instead of enabling, saying no when he needed to and following through on consequences when Bailey tested boundaries. Amy felt safe in her own home for the first time in years. She didn't hide in her room anymore or worry about her things disappearing. The necklace sat in Amy's jewelry box now where she could look at it whenever she wanted, a symbol of family legacy properly honored. We still had hard days when old patterns would emerge. Bailey would get defensive about something minor, or Todd would hesitate before enforcing a rule. But we were all doing the work in therapy to build healthier relationships. Our family therapist said we'd made remarkable progress considering where we started. I finally felt like we were moving forward instead of just surviving each day. It wasn't a perfect happy ending with everyone magically fixed and all problems solved, but it was real progress that we all earned through hard work and honesty, through facing uncomfortable truths and making difficult changes, and that felt more valuable than any fairy tale resolution could have been.